Well, good day, everybody, and thank you for joining the Navient Solutions Spotlight. Today's topic is on-base integrations. My name is Guy Schrader. I am the Manager of Sales Engineering here at Navient, and I will be your moderator. Actually, I'll be your only presenter during this actual presentation today. So as oftentimes we do, here are just a couple housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, will be available off of Navient's website once this recording is uploaded. So later today or tomorrow, so feel free to share that with your colleagues. And I believe you will also get an email from our marketing group letting you know that the recording is available. So feel free to share it from that perspective. Since we are recording, you are all muted on this webinar. So if you do wish to communicate with me, if you have really just some general issues with the webinar, please use the chat panel. But otherwise, for any questions that you have about the content of this presentation, please use the questions panel that you see within GoToMeeting there. And when you actually leave this webinar, you should see a survey. I do encourage that you complete that survey at the end of this webinar. We actually review those. So if you have any ideas for future topics, please present them within that survey. So without any further ado, a high-level agenda. Integrations is such a broad topic. So by no means are we actually going to be covering these items in this particular order, but we'll touch on all of them as we go through here. Why would you as an organization want to integrate with another system within your on-base system? There's different categories of integrations that we'll talk through between indexing assistance, ingesting documents, exposing on-base content to third-party systems, and exchanging data between systems. There are a handful of purpose-built integrations that Hyland has already developed, and we'll talk through some of those, but then really get into some of the integration tools, considerations for licensing as it relates to your on-base system, and also talking through some different thoughts on selecting the best tool. And we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers. Again, encourage you to ask those questions. We'll save them all to the end of the webinar, but please pose them within the questions panel. So first off, why would you want to integrate on-base with another system? It all comes down to time and money, doesn't it? So really that efficiency and cost savings. For those that have been around the industry for a long time like I have, think back where we were 20 years ago when systems really didn't communicate, well, probably even longer than that. You'd be working in one system and then you'd have to go log on another system to get another piece of information. You might have to go elsewhere to go find some additional documents or information. All of that takes time. And in the business world, that all equates to money, right? So there's different ways that we can tie on-base together with other systems that you might be using. And that first sub-bullet point, exposing the related content to the users and systems and interfaces that your users are in all day long. So think, if you work in the human resources area, you're in a human capital management system. Well, let's link the stored documents that are inside of on-base, those employee documents, to that HCM system. Or you work in an ERP or a CRM system. Let's expose any of those customer-related documents, vendor-related documents, or even documents relating to the transaction to that system, or even extending that out through a customer-facing portal. All different ways that we can integrate. Or if you're working in the government space, think of public records that need to be exposed. on-base can store and manage those, but we can now extend those to that government website that you might have. There's situations where you have data that exists in other systems that we want to leverage, whether that be for indexing assistance, whether we want to be bringing that content into on-base, importing it in an automated fashion and leveraging that data that we already have, or even sharing data between systems. Think of workflow processes where we may be starting a process where OCR, or optical character recognition, is extracting information off of incoming documents. You're using on-base workflow with that data for all of the processes. You're adding additional data throughout the process, but ultimately we now want to post that transaction into another system. That's a great example of now sharing data between systems where OnBase is the source, destination is some other line of business application. So some of these different categories that I mentioned as I was going through the agenda, indexing assistance is one of those. And this is a relatively basic one. And I'm sure that a lot of you are probably using this in some form or fashion today if you're running OnBase. Data exists within some other system, whether that be an ERP system, a human capital management system, any other database system. And we want to now leverage that data while we're indexing documents. Rather than me manually filling in 10 different pieces of 10 different keywords inside of OnBase, and with my typing skills, I'm gonna make mistakes. I'm not gonna be overly fast to type that in 10 times over. So speed, accuracy, and validating that information. That master data lives within that other system. That's now automatically validating that as that's bringing back to OnBase, I can visually see that I have the correct record. So in OnBase terms, what we're talking about here is an autofill keyword set. And there's two different types of that, whether that's internal to OnBase, where we load into OnBase that data in a periodic basis that we can use for indexing assistance, or whether we're looking external, which means that we have a SQL query where real time, we're querying that third-party database based upon a primary keyword that we're entering into OnBase to return back all of the other related information that the other system has. So very quick screenshot demo here. I'm just indexing an I-9 form document. So the user is still going to be importing this document. However, we're getting into the system. This works anytime that I'm indexing a document where I can enter one key piece of information, in this case, the employee name. When I tab off of that field, that autofill keyword set, whether I'm querying internal to OnBase or external, as soon as I tab off of that, it's going to return back all of the rest of the information for Andrew Lincoln in this particular case and fill in all those keywords for me. Very fast, very efficient, and we're using that master data that's coming from another system. If Andrew Lincoln wasn't found, none of this would fill in. And that's another validation piece, insurance saying that, well, it doesn't exist there. Am I actually indexing this to the appropriate employee? Besides that autofill keyword set, we also have the capability of using application enabler. So another different integration method that we have available to us, that's an OnBase product that effectively is configured to monitor and look for keystrokes or mouse events that's going to effectively scrape the data off of another line of business application. And within that configuration, we've actually mapped that to OnBase keywords and fields. So think in the scenario where we're indexing documents and we're doing somewhat of a key from image into our line of business application. We've captured it into OnBase. We're now keying that into a line of business application. It's a perfect example how we could actually use this for indexing. But beyond indexing the documents, we can even create and populate eForm fields, whether that be Unity form or traditional eForm, or even a WorkView object, or even leverage that data that happens to be on that screen to use OnBase document composition to create a Microsoft document, a Word from a Microsoft Word template. So again, a relatively quick screenshot demo of that. On the left side of my screen, I have my ERP system. Whatever line of business application that you might have, I have a transaction in this particular case open where I now have all of that data exposed on that particular screen. On the right side, I have OnBase, and it happens to be a workflow interface where I have a workflow action already invoked saying I want to re-index this document. All of those keywords are currently blank, but I invoke on my ERP screen that keystroke or that mouse event, and it lifts off of that screen on the left all of the mapped information, and that's mapped into OnBase keywords, however that makes the most sense. So again, speeds up that entry where I don't have to re-enter that information twice, once into my ERP system and once into OnBase. We just enter it that one time into the ERP, and we invoke that keystroke or that mouse combination to copy and paste that information. Think of integrating now also in a different fashion. I have documents that are either accumulating in other systems or are actually generated by other systems that I want to store them in OnBase as part of my document of record. In that situation, again, that content is created, received by that other system. I want to have a method now where I can efficiently store and get that document indexed accordingly inside of OnBase. And there's a variety of different ways that this can happen. Think one system that we can integrate with is email. We have an integration from Microsoft Outlook and Mailbox Importer, two separate OnBase products. They differ a little bit in how they actually function. But rather than printing out a document, and God forbid you ever print a document to scan it into OnBase, I look at that as being the perfect opportunity that we can go ahead and integrate in some form or fashion. Keep that document digital, save the paper, save the effort in indexing that document. In general, email is something very similar. I have that electronically as I'm receiving it. I can get that into OnBase, and I can even automate the indexing to a certain extent based upon some of that email metadata if it comes down to it. Other content that might be generated by different systems, think your ERP or your human capital management or learning management system, whatever that be, generates documents. Again, I want to have OnBase store them because maybe your ERP or other line of business application doesn't display those documents well after they're originally generated. We have capabilities of now importing that into OnBase in an automated fashion through these different import processors. Even through the application programmer interface or an API, and we'll talk about APIs as we go through this a little bit further. But anytime, again, where documents are being generated by other systems, there's probably a good way that we can get that into OnBase. I consider that an integration. Some people don't, but I really think it's important that you consider these different pieces. And we find the most efficient way where that can be a hands-off process. Nobody even really has to touch this after that document is generated by the originating system. OnBase has been configured to know how to pick that up and how to index that document accordingly based upon the information coming from that line of business system. So the key here is that depending upon what the capabilities of that source system are, that may vary what the actual OnBase solution is and how it needs to be configured to get that content into OnBase. Exposing OnBase content to third-party systems, that's another category of integrations as I look at it. Given OnBase has worked with a number of these different software developers, and they've put together these purpose-built integrations, and you see them listed on the screen. Really, those systems work great within their space, whether it be a CRM or an ERP system or electronic medical records, mapping software, insurance, DocuSign, I think everybody's somewhat familiar with. Those are all different integrations that are going to have different feature sets depending upon how those were actually configured. So these are somewhat out-of-the-box integrations that Hyland has developed that work with these different systems. And in general, what we're talking about here is that OnBase stored content is now going to be linked, exposed through that third-party system for viewing and or retrieval. As I mentioned, there's different feature sets here, so it's going to vary somewhat depending upon each of these different systems, what those actual capabilities are. But just using an example of Salesforce, OnBase has a really nice integration with Salesforce, where in this particular case, I happen to have this account open for Plain Orange Plastics. We have some of this metadata, but then OnBase has been configured within this integration to provide this Documents tab, where now I can see all of the different documents that are stored inside of OnBase related to this particular account. That happens dynamically. This is the level of integration that we're talking about, bringing those documents to the line of business application where the users typically live all day long. But in this case, we have the ability to filter down if this is a long list based upon a contract request or the document type name or the contract type, or even importing documents. These are all different capabilities exposed as part of this particular purpose-built integration. And then when I select any one of those documents, I can view it directly right in line inside of that Salesforce application and even exposing the OnBase keywords that we happen to see on the left-hand side of the screen highlighted in that pink. There's different ways of doing this besides those purpose-built integrations, because think there's probably hundreds, tens of thousands of different applications that are out there. OnBase does not have a purpose-built integration for each and every one of them. So using that same application enabler tool that I mentioned before that we were using for indexing assistance, that same application enabler tool can be utilized to now display OnBase content related to the transaction that I'm on directly from that line of business application. So again, we're using that screen data, configuring OnBase behind the scenes to pass that query on to OnBase, and then displaying those search results within a separate window. And that's a key piece to this. It's always going to be a separate window in this particular scenario, because we're not modifying that source application whatsoever. That becomes another key component to this. So non-programmatically, point and click configured, we can set up OnBase where it's sitting here monitoring this line of business application. We're looking for a specific keystroke or mouse event that can then execute a query into OnBase, and in that separate window then displays the OnBase stored content related to that transaction. Again, on the left side of the screen, I'm using information such as this purchase order or this invoice number to actually retrieve that specific invoice number associated with that same PO based upon the OnBase keywords that are actually configured. But I can return more than one document. Here I happen to have a check that came along with it, allow the user to select which particular document that they want. But another key component to this is you have all of OnBase capabilities at your fingertips once this document has actually been displayed. You can review those keywords, you can check the document history, you can even interact with any workflow if this document happens to be inside of workflow at this point in time. There's something else that could potentially be exposed here that are called POP technologies. And these are all a natural extension of the OnBase web server capability. So you do need to be licensed and have a valid OnBase web server installed, where between DocPop, FolderPop, PDFPop, and FormPop, they have different capabilities where now that gives us the ability from an external application. That application has to dynamically construct a hyperlink or a button that is behind the scenes, constructs this URL to search, properly formatted URL, that's going to now be passed to OnBase through the OnBase web server and whichever these different POP technologies to display the content in the default browser window. So again, that's going to be a whole separate window from your line of business application, but a different nice way of being able to do this. And using a very similar example to what we had before, same exact enterprise ERP screen that I had before, but notice I have a hyperlink built into this related documents text, or that could be behind that folder icon. Really what this requires is that you do have to have the ability to modify that line of business application to be able to dynamically construct that URL. So if you have that capability, this is a nice next level of integration that we can utilize, where there's a visual indicator on that screen. They can click on that. Then that opens up a separate window. In this case, it happens to be a browser window that's working off of the OnBase web server, returning back, in this scenario, the exact same documents that we showed before. This time I just happen to be showing the check. But again, this is now coming through an OnBase web server look and feel specific to those documents that we actually wanted to retrieve. Now we start getting into some of the more detailed stuff. Application programmer interfaces, APIs, you might have heard that term. So I'm speaking more to some of those people that have programming type capabilities, or you have those type of folks available on your staff. OnBase does have two very robust APIs available to it. There's something called the Unity API, which has been around a number of years. There's a newer API that's out there that's a REST API, and REST really is a little bit of an industry standard for how APIs are developed. So that REST API is great. to allow people that are familiar with RESTful APIs to develop calls to OnBase to be able to now interact. All things said and done, when we're talking about these APIs, your developers are going to have access to a software development kit, otherwise known as an SDK. There's a variety of different functions and calls that can be performed through that SDK from that line of business application to OnBase. And there's so many different things that these APIs can perform quite simply. You can say, hey, I want to call and retrieve a document inside of OnBase. Maybe I want to go ahead and update some OnBase keywords based upon the information on the screen. Maybe I want to bring up that document within workflow. Maybe I want to open up a new Unity form and populate it with the information that's coming from my source line of business application. Those are just 4 very quick examples of what the API can do, but this is really going to be the tightest level of integration that you can have between OnBase and another system. But it does require programming skills to be able to configure these different pieces together. Somewhat goes back to the capabilities of that source system also. Do you have access to change any of that code? Is there an API available from that source system to be able to talk with the OnBase API? So 2 APIs talking together. So lots of considerations as it goes along here. A different way of looking at this now is saying, hey, I want to exchange data that we have in OnBase or a third party with OnBase. So one example, I think I had stated this earlier, you have an OnBase workflow process fronted with maybe some OCR or some data entry. OnBase is accumulating all of this metadata pertaining to this transaction. At the end of the process, I want to post a transaction to a line of business application. We can do that inside of OnBase, and then there's a variety of different ways that we can do that. Conversely, we may want to take data from a third-party system that does get updated. That third-party system might be the system of record. The data is going to change as time goes by, but we want to make sure that that data is synchronized with OnBase. We can send that data to OnBase to update OnBase keywords so that now all of that information is searchable, findable based upon the same metadata that we have inside of our line of business system. And there's a variety of different ways for how we can address that data interchange. We could construct just what we call a flat file transfer. This is a batch mode integration where we write to a file. That file sits there and we accumulate to that, and then the destination system picks that up on a periodic basis. This is an older technologies, but still utilized quite often today in the OnBase world, depending upon the capabilities of the system that we're sending that transaction to, which kind of ties into the next few. Staging tables. Some systems do have staging tables that we can write directly to from OnBase, and then that software system has the capability of now taking that data from the staging tables and natively uploading that information into the real-time transactions that are out there. Third-party systems, again, some of them do have APIs available to them. We can send data through the OnBase API into a third-party system, and there may be other methods that might be out there as we're talking about interchanging data between different systems here. So we've covered a lot of ground so far as it relates to integrations, but there are some scenarios where OnBase doesn't integrate with other systems because of lack of functionality. And hence the reason I just bring up one slide to talk about robotic process automation, or RPA. There are some scenarios that we've encountered where we can't programmatically get at the data that we're looking at or documents via some of the integrations that are available to us. Hence, we have products like RPA that really can take the place of API integrations. It's another toolkit that has a wide variety of capabilities that can automate any number of different tasks that you might have. And these are products that are actually completely independent of OnBase. While OnBase does have an RPA product, there are plenty of others that are available on the marketplace that are out there that allows us to now use RPA, put a robot effectively that can interact in different levels and ways to pass information and functions between different systems. I like to look at this in a relatively simplistic way. Manually, you might have to go out to a website, authenticate to that website, perform a search to effectively look at some data in a system where now you're taking that data from that third-party system, that website, and manually putting that into another system. That's part of a process. If that's a repeatable process and you're doing that quite often, that could be a perfect candidate for RPA solutions to have that bot go do all of that query work. That's 100% behind the scenes, replicating what a human would actually be doing. That's just one example of how that technology plays in. But again, I look at this as being another way of filling some of the gaps that can't be handled directly by some of the OnBase technologies. As I mentioned within the agenda, we'll talk about some of the OnBase licensing considerations here. Any method that we're talking about here, talking with OnBase is going to require some type of connection with OnBase. We are at minimum going to consume a client license to be able to get at the OnBase data. There's another way of looking at this also. It's called a query API block. And that's probably a better scenario for those integrations that we're building with portals where people aren't really authenticating a customer-facing portal, for example. We can set up query blocks where you're not consuming those client licenses inside of OnBase. It's just counting that query per hour against a block of queries that you might actually have in your systems. So keep that in mind. How do you select the proper tool? You've seen so much information that I've shared here. There's really a bunch of considerations, and I like to always start by saying, from an end user perspective, what impact is this integration going to have on their world? Are they an internal user or somebody external to the world coming in through a portal? Are they an OnBase user or not? That might direct us in a different direction for which integration method to use. What's the timeliness of the data that we might be passing between systems? Can we use a batch mode integration, or does this really require real-time lookup or real-time posting of a transaction to another system? Could take us a completely different route in what integration that we're looking at. What are the third-party tool capabilities? Do they have an API available? Can they accept a flat file? So on and so forth. That oftentimes drives what we decide to do inside of OnBase, not so much what OnBase capabilities are, because we have all of these things at our disposal, but what the third-party tool is capable of, which puts us down a specific path. And what are you looking for ongoing maintenance and support? If we develop an API for you, that's code, and you don't have coding staff on skills on staff, that might be difficult for you to maintain that going forward. So we do take a look at that also, saying things are going to change over time. We all realize over the past however many years, look how different the world is today than it was 2 years ago. We may have to make some modifications to different systems, to these interfaces. While Navient is always here, you might choose to go with a different level of integration so that you don't have to have that programming staff available on your staff. So a handful of resources, and I'm just going to fly through the slide. There's different resources that are available inside of OnBase, that different OnBase websites that might be pertinent here. Always contact your Navient account executive. They are always going to bring in the appropriate resource from Navient as we start talking about integration so that we can make the most pertinent recommendation for you. So with that, I am going to pop open my questions pane and see whether I can knock these off relatively quickly. So Jennifer, it looked like you might have had an audio problem because I'm seeing plenty of other questions. I'm assuming other people were able to hear this whole presentation. Do you integrate with financial software like Envision and WinCap? OnBase does not have a specific integration built, a purpose-built integration for that, but using some of the other methods that we talked about, we'd want to have that conversation to determine what are the capabilities of those other systems for integration and recommend the appropriate method. Hopefully that answers your question. Do you have technical documentation that you'd be able to share? Well, Tim, that's really looking at these resources that I have up on the screen. If you're looking for API level integrations, that sdk.onbase.com is going to be great. Otherwise, take a look at the Hyland community and probably pull up the appropriate modular reference guide for some of that information. And the last question that I have, are there any new purpose-built integrations upcoming for Hyland, i.e. PeopleSoft or ServiceNow? It's a great question, Dwayne. Unfortunately, I don't have that level of visibility from Hyland's development level for what's upcoming. I know that there is an integration for PeopleSoft, as we talked about. ServiceNow, I cannot specifically state whether there's something coming or not. Again, be more than happy to have those conversations and take a deeper dive if it comes down to it. All right, with that, I apologize for taking an extra minute of your day, but if you have any further questions, please reach out to your Navient account executive. We'd love to interact with you further and see what we can actually come up with. And with that, since we're getting so close to Thanksgiving and the holiday season upon us, I wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving and hope that you have a great remainder of the week. Everybody take care. Thanks.